Call for backup. Officer Daniels barked into his radio, his voice cracking with urgency. His hands shook as he held the little girl's trembling shoulders. Her wide, tear-streaked face was lit only by the distant glow of the street lamp. For whispered words, just four, had shattered the silence of the quiet neighborhood and sent chills racing down his spine. His partner, Officer Ramirez, stood frozen, his hand on his holster, unable to comprehend what was happening. Daniels scanned the area, his senses heightened. "Stay right here," he whispered to the girl. She nodded, her small hands gripping the hem of her pink dress. As he stepped back toward the cruiser, rustling sound came from the nearby bushes. Something, or someone, was watching. "Ramirez, cover me," Daniels whispered. Before either could act, the girl's voice called out weakly, "Don't leave me." Her plea echoed in the stillness, as if to remind them this was no ordinary night. It had started like any other evening for Officer Daniels. His patrol shift was winding down, and the night had been uneventful. A couple of routine stops, a neighborly dispute over a loud dog, and a minor fender bender outside a diner. The humdrum rhythm of the job had lulled him into a sense of calm. "Let's swing by Elm Street," Daniels suggested to Ramirez. "Just to check. That corner's been quiet lately, too quiet." Ramirez, sipping his lukewarm coffee, shrugged. "Elm Street's a snooze fest. I'll bet $10 it's just more cats knocking over trash cans." But as they turned onto the dimly lit street, Daniels spotted her. A small figure, no older than 7 or 8, walking barefoot in the middle of the road. Her pink dress was torn at the hem, and she clutched a stuffed rabbit missing an ear. Something about her was haunting, like she didn't belong there. Daniels pulled the cruiser to a stop, and both officers got out. "Hey there, sweetheart," he called softly, crouching down to her level. "Are you lost? Where's your family?" The girl didn't answer. Her big, round eyes stared up at him, brimming with fear. She looked past him, over his shoulder, as if expecting something, or someone, to appear. "It's okay." Daniels tried again, his voice gentle. "We're here to help." She finally spoke, but it was a whisper so faint he almost didn't catch it. "They're coming." Daniels frowned. "Who's coming? Is someone chasing you?" The girl's lip trembled, and her eyes darted to the shadows. Ramirez exchanged a wary glance with Daniels. "Kid, you need to tell us what's going on," Ramirez urged. The girl hesitated, then leaned in close to Daniels, her tiny hand clutching his sleeve. Her breath was warm against his ear as she whispered 4 words that would change everything. "They're already here." Back in the present, the weight of those words hung heavy in Daniels' mind. His instinct screamed at him to retreat, to grab the girl and get her to safety, but his duty kept him grounded. He glanced at Ramirez, who was scanning the perimeter with his flashlight. The beam danced across the street, slicing through the darkness. "Anything?" Daniels asked. Ramirez shook his head. "Nothing. But something doesn't feel right." Daniels nodded in agreement. The street, lined with old, creaky houses, seemed to hold its breath. Even the usual hum of crickets and distant traffic was absent. It was too quiet. He turned back to the girl. "Sweetheart, I need you to stay close to me, okay? We're going to keep you safe." She didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the shadowy figure now, emerging from behind the bushes. It was tall, looming, its face obscured by darkness. Daniels instinctively reached for his weapon. "Ramirez," he barked. The figure moved fast, too fast. It darted back into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Ramirez cursed under his breath, his flashlight trembling in his grip. "Did you see that?" he whispered. Daniels nodded, his heart pounding. "Stay sharp. We're not alone out here." The little girl clung to Daniel's leg, her stuffed rabbit pressed tightly against her chest. "They're watching," she said, her voice barely audible. "Who, sweetheart?" Daniels asked, keeping his tone steady despite the growing fear gnawing at him. "Who's watching?" Before she could answer, a piercing scream erupted from one of the nearby houses. It was a sound that froze the blood, a sound of pure terror. Daniels and Ramirez exchanged a grim look. "Backup's on the way," Ramirez said, his voice tight. "Let's move." Daniels scooped up the girl, her small arms wrapping around his neck. "Stay with me, kid," he murmured. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that unseen eyes were tracking their every move. As they approached the house, the scream abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Ramirez raised his weapon, nodding for Daniels to cover him. The girl buried her face in Daniels' shoulder, her muffled sobs the only sound breaking the stillness. The front door creaked open, its hinges groaning like a warning. Daniels swallowed hard, his pulse hammering in his ears. He stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the darkened hallway. What they found inside would haunt them forever. But that revelation was just the beginning. The house was eerily silent. Daniels' flashlight scanned the dimly lit interior, the beam bouncing off cracked wallpaper and a floor littered with broken furniture. The air was heavy, thick with a metallic smell that made him instinctively grip his weapon tighter. Ramirez stepped in cautiously behind him, his boots crunching against shattered glass. "This place looks like a war zone," he muttered. Daniels nodded, his senses on edge. "Stay close. We don't know what we're dealing with." The little girl clung to him like a lifeline, her small hands trembling against his uniform. She didn't speak, but her wide, fearful eyes darted around the room as if she knew something they didn't. "Hello?" Daniels called out, his voice steady despite the rising tension. "This is the police. Is anyone here?" No response. They moved further into the house, the flashlight revealing overturned chairs and deep gouges in the wooden floor. The living room was in complete disarray, but there were no signs of life, only chaos. Then they saw it. A message, smeared in what looked horrifyingly like blood, scrawled across the far wall. "You're too late." Daniels froze. His stomach churned as the words registered. Ramirez exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. "What in the hell is this?" he hissed. The girl whimpered, burying her face deeper into Daniel's shoulder. He patted her back instinctively, trying to reassure her even as his own fear mounted. "Ramirez, check the other rooms," Daniels ordered, his voice low. "I'll stay with her." Ramirez hesitated for a moment before nodding. He drew his weapon and headed down the hallway, his flashlight casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. Daniels stayed in the living room, his eyes scanning every corner for movement. The girl finally spoke, her voice trembling. "They told me not to come here." Daniels looked down at her, his brow furrowing. "Who told you that?" "The people who are after you." She nodded, her tiny frame shaking. "They said it's their house now, that no one else is supposed to come inside." Daniels felt a chill run down his spine. "Who are they, sweetheart? Can you tell me what they look like?" Her lips quivered as she tried to form the words. Before she could answer, a loud crash echoed from down the hallway. Ramirez's voice rang out, sharp and urgent. "Daniels, get over here now." Daniels didn't hesitate. With the girl still in his arms, he moved quickly down the hall, his flashlight leading the way. The beam illuminated Ramirez standing outside a partially open door. His face was pale, and his gun was drawn. "What is it?" Daniels demanded. Ramirez gestured to the door. "You need to see this." Daniels set the girl down carefully, telling her to stay put. She crouched against the wall, clutching her stuffed rabbit. His heart pounded as he stepped closer to the door, his flashlight cutting through the darkness inside. What he saw stopped him cold. The room was empty except for a single chair in the center. Tied to the chair was a mannequin, its face grotesquely painted to resemble a screaming person. Around its neck hung a sign that read, "You're next." Daniels felt bile rise in his throat. "Is this some kind of sick joke?" he muttered. Ramirez shook his head. "Doesn't feel like a joke, man. This is something else." The little girl whimpered behind them, and both officers turned to look at her. She was pointing toward the window at the end of the hallway, her eyes wide with terror. "They're outside," she whispered. Daniels and Ramirez exchanged a glance, then moved to the window. Peering through the cracked glass, Daniels' stomach sank. In the faint moonlight, he could make out figures standing in the street. There were at least 5 of them, their shapes shadowy and indistinct. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching the house. Ramirez cursed under his breath. "We need to call for more backup." Daniels nodded, reaching for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 34. We've got multiple unidentified individuals outside a residence on Elm Street, requesting immediate assistance." The radio crackled with static, but no response came. "Dispatch, do you copy?" Daniels repeated, his voice rising in urgency. Still nothing. "Damn it," Ramirez muttered. "The signal's dead." The girl tugged on Daniel's sleeve, her face pale. "They don't want anyone to help," she said softly. "They always make sure no one can call for help." Daniels stared at her, his mind racing. "How do you know that? What do they want?" Her answer was barely audible. "They want everyone to leave." Ramirez pulled his flashlight back toward the figures outside. "They're still just standing there, not moving." "Not yet," the girl said, her voice trembling. Daniels felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He turned to Ramirez. "We need to get her out of here. Now." As if in response, the front door slammed shut with a deafening bang, the sound reverberating through the house. The girl screamed, and the officers spun around, their weapons drawn. A low, guttural noise began to echo from somewhere within the house, a sound that didn't belong to any human. It was deep, unearthly, and growing louder. Daniels grabbed the girl and pulled her close. "Ramirez, we're getting out of here." But Ramirez was frozen, his eyes locked on the darkened hallway ahead of them. "Daniels," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "we're not alone in here." As the guttural sound grew nearer, the lights flickered once before going out completely, plunging them into total darkness. The darkness was suffocating, and the guttural sound reverberated through the house, sending chills down Daniel's spine. His flashlight flickered erratically, casting brief, shaky glimpses of the hallway around them. "Ramirez, stay close," Daniels shouted, his voice barely concealing his fear. "I'm right here," Ramirez replied, his tone tight with panic. His flashlight beam scanned the hallway wildly, catching nothing but shadows. The little girl clung to Daniels like a lifeline, her tiny fingers digging into his uniform. Her muffled sobs were the only human sound in the oppressive silence that followed the creature's growl. "Sweetheart," Daniels whispered, crouching low to her level, "you need to tell me what's going on. What's in this house?" Her tear-streaked face tilted up toward him, and her lips quivered as she spoke. "They told me it's their home now. They don't like visitors." "Who told you that?" Ramirez cut in, his flashlight steadying as he pointed it toward the hallway. "Are we dealing with some kind of cult?" The girl shook her head, her voice barely audible. "They're not people." Daniels froze. "What do you mean, not people?" Before she could answer, the guttural sound returned, louder this time, as if whatever was making it had drawn closer. A scraping noise followed, like nails dragging across the walls. Ramirez swung his flashlight toward the sound, but the beam revealed nothing. "I don't like this," Ramirez muttered. "Daniels, we need to move. Now." Daniels nodded. He lifted the girl into his arms and whispered, "Hold on tight." Her small arms wrapped around his neck as he rose to his feet. "Back to the front door," Daniels ordered, his voice firm despite the dread clawing at him. "Let's get out of this house." They retraced their steps, moving as quickly and quietly as possible. Every creak of the floorboards beneath their feet felt deafening in the otherwise still house. Ramirez led the way, his weapon drawn, while Daniels followed, his flashlight shaking slightly in his grip. But when they reached the living room, their hearts sank. The front door was no longer just closed, it was barricaded. Heavy furniture that hadn't been there before was now piled against it. A couch, a dresser, and what looked like a bookcase. "What the hell?" Ramirez whispered, his voice trembling. "We just came through here. How did this happen?" Daniel's mind raced. He shifted his grip on the girl, trying to keep his composure. "We'll find another way out," he said, though even he wasn't sure if he believed it. As they turned to head toward the kitchen, the guttural growl erupted again, this time deafeningly close. The girl screamed, and Daniels whipped around, his flashlight catching a fleeting glimpse of something in the corner of the room, a shadow that moved too fast for him to register. "There's something in here," Ramirez shouted, backing up toward Daniels. The growling stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, raspy whisper. The voice was inhuman, dripping with malice. "Leave now." Daniels tightened his grip on the girl, his heart pounding. "We're trying," he shouted back, his voice firm despite his fear. "Just let us go." The whisper turned into a laugh, slow, chilling, and full of menace. It echoed around the room, as if the walls themselves were mocking them. "Ramirez," Daniels said, his voice low and urgent. "We need to find another exit. Now." Ramirez nodded, his flashlight darting toward the kitchen doorway. "This way." They moved quickly, the girl burying her face in Daniel's chest. The kitchen was just as wrecked as the living room, with broken dishes scattered across the floor and cabinet doors hanging off their hinges. The back door, thankfully, was in sight. "There." Ramirez pointed, relief evident in his voice. Daniels reached the door first, shifting the girl to one arm as he grabbed the doorknob. He twisted it, but it didn't budge. Locked. "Ramirez, help me," Daniels called, his voice strained. Ramirez rushed to his side, slamming his shoulder against the door. As they struggled to force it open, the guttural growl returned, louder and more menacing than ever. It was coming from the hallway they had just left. "Whatever it is, it's coming," Ramirez shouted. "Hurry." Daniels threw his weight against the door, the hinges groaning under the strain. Come on," he muttered through gritted teeth. Suddenly, the girl screamed again, her voice shrill with terror. "It's here." Daniels turned just in time to see a shadowy figure emerging from the hallway. It was tall and twisted, its limbs unnaturally long and its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The growling intensified as it moved toward them, its steps slow and deliberate, as if savoring their fear. "Ramirez, cover us," Daniels shouted, his adrenaline surging. He slammed his shoulder against the door one last time, and it burst open with a loud crack. "Go," Ramirez yelled, firing a shot toward the creature. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the house, but the figure didn't flinch. It only laughed, the sound deep and bone-chilling. Daniels bolted through the door, the girl clinging to him tightly. Ramirez followed, slamming the door shut behind them. They stumbled into the backyard, the cool night air hitting them like a wave of relief. But the relief was short-lived. As they caught their breath, the girl pointed toward the tree line at the edge of the yard. Her voice was barely a whisper. "They're out there, too." Daniels and Ramirez turned, their flashlights revealing more shadowy figures lurking among the trees. They were surrounded. Daniels' pulse thundered in his ears as he counted the shadowy figures emerging from the tree line. There were at least a dozen, their silhouettes elongated and unnaturally distorted in the pale moonlight. They stood motionless, their glowing eyes fixed on the small group in the yard. "Ramirez," Daniels said, his voice low but urgent. "We can't stay here." Ramirez, still catching his breath, nodded. "We've got to make it to the cruiser. It's our only chance." Daniels glanced at the girl in his arms. She was shaking uncontrollably, her face buried against his chest. He crouched slightly to meet her tearful gaze. "Listen to me, sweetheart. We're going to run, okay? I need you to hold on tight. Can you do that?" She nodded weakly, clutching his uniform. "Ramirez," Daniels said, "you take the lead. I'll cover the rear." Ramirez raised his weapon and moved cautiously toward the side gate that led to the front yard. His flashlight flickered over the tall wooden fence, searching for any signs of movement. The figures by the tree line didn't move. They stood silently, their glowing eyes following every step. "Why aren't they attacking?" Ramirez muttered, his voice tinged with suspicion. "What are they waiting for?" Daniels didn't have an answer, but he knew better than to question their luck. He tightened his grip on the girl and followed Ramirez toward the gate. The creak of the gate's rusty hinges sounded deafening in the tense silence. Ramirez pushed it open, his flashlight cutting through the shadows of the front yard. The cruiser was parked just down the street, its blue and red lights still flashing faintly. "There it is," Ramirez said, relief flooding his voice. But the moment they stepped out of the backyard, the figures moved. The shadows from the tree line began gliding toward them. Not running, not walking, but moving unnaturally fast, their forms shifting and flickering like projections on a faulty screen. "They're coming," the girl screamed. "Run!" Daniels shouted. They sprinted toward the cruiser, Ramirez leading the way with his flashlight bobbing wildly. Daniels pushed his legs to move faster, the girl's weight in his arms feeling heavier with every step. Behind them, the guttural growling started again, joined by a chorus of raspy whispers and eerie laughter. The sound grew louder and closer with every second. "Ramirez, keys!" Daniels yelled. Ramirez fumbled in his pocket as they reached the cruiser. His hands trembled as he pulled the keys out and unlocked the doors. "Get in!" he shouted. Daniels yanked open the back door and slid the girl inside. "Stay down and don't move," he told her before slamming the door shut. He and Ramirez climbed into the front seats, their movements frantic. Ramirez started the engine, the cruiser roaring to life. "Go, go, go," Daniels urged. The tires screeched as Ramirez slammed on the gas, the cruiser lurching forward. In the rearview mirror, Daniels watched as the shadowy figures closed the distance. They reached the edge of the street, their glowing eyes burning like embers in the darkness. But they didn't chase the cruiser. They stopped. Daniels' brow furrowed. "Why aren't they following us?" Ramirez didn't answer, his focus locked on the road ahead. The cruiser sped through the empty streets, the flashing lights cutting through the darkness. The girl's voice broke the tense silence. "They're not leaving because they don't need to." Daniels turned to look at her. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, her small hands clutching her stuffed rabbit. "They already marked us." Daniels exchanged a glance with Ramirez, the unease in his gut growing stronger. "Marked us? What does that mean?" "They can find you anywhere now," she said, her voice trembling. "They'll keep coming." Ramirez's knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel. "Is there anywhere they can't follow us? Someplace safe?" The girl shook her head. "They always find their way. They don't stop until they're done." The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. Daniels turned to her again, his voice firm. "Then tell us what they want. Why are they after you?" Tears welled in her eyes as she looked up at him. "Because I didn't listen. I went where I wasn't supposed to." "What does that mean?" Daniels pressed. Before she could answer, the cruiser's headlights flickered and the engine sputtered. "No, no, no," Ramirez muttered, slamming his foot on the gas pedal. But the cruiser slowed, the engine choking as if it were being strangled by an unseen force. "What's happening?" Daniels demanded. "I don't know," Ramirez shouted, frantically turning the wheel as the cruiser rolled to a stop on the side of the road. The flashing lights on the roof flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. Daniels grabbed his flashlight and turned it on, his heart pounding. "We're sitting ducks out here." The girl's voice was barely audible. "They're here." Daniels turned toward her, his blood running cold. Her wide eyes were fixed on something outside the window. He followed her gaze and saw them. The shadowy figures were standing in a circle around the cruiser, their glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. They hadn't made a sound, not a single growl or whisper, but their presence was suffocating. "What do we do?" Ramirez asked, his voice laced with panic. Daniels didn't have an answer. His mind raced as he tried to come up with a plan. But before he could speak, the girl whispered something that made his blood run colder than it already had. "They're not alone this time." A deep, guttural roar erupted from the darkness, louder and more menacing than anything they had heard before. The cruiser shook violently, the windows rattling as if the very air around them had come alive. Something massive was out there, something far worse than the figures surrounding them. Daniels gripped his weapon, his heart hammering in his chest. "Stay calm," he told the girl, though his own fear was threatening to take over. "We're going to get through this." But deep down, he wasn't sure if that was true. The cruiser rocked again, harder this time, as if something enormous had slammed into it. The sound of metal groaning under pressure filled the air, followed by the girl's terrified scream. Daniels held her close, his mind racing. "Ramirez, keep your weapon ready," he barked, his voice tense. "We might have to fight our way out." Ramirez gritted his teeth, gripping his gun tightly. "Fight what, Daniels? We can't even see what's out there." Another guttural roar split the night, so loud and deep it seemed to vibrate through their very bones. Outside, The shadowy figures circled the cruiser like predators waiting for the right moment to strike. Their glowing eyes burned through the darkness, and now, something else was emerging, a shape far larger and more menacing than anything they'd seen before. The girl whimpered, burying her face in Daniel's chest. "It's him," she whispered. "He's here." Daniels leaned down to her level, his voice calm despite the fear gripping him. "Who's him, sweetheart? You need to tell us." She shook her head violently. "I can't. If I say his name, it'll make him stronger." Ramirez cursed under his breath, his eyes darting around the windows. "This is insane. We're stuck here, and whatever's out there isn't going to wait forever." Suddenly, the cruiser's roof caved in slightly with a loud thunk, as if something heavy had landed on top. Both officers froze, their eyes snapping upward. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed above them, each step heavier than the last. On the roof, Ramirez whispered, his voice barely audible. Daniels slowly reached for his radio, even though he knew it was futile. "Dispatch, Unit 34. We're under attack and surrounded by unknown hostiles. We need immediate assistance." His voice cracked as he spoke, the static from the radio his only reply. The girl's voice broke through the tension. "He knows you're calling for help," she said softly. "He'll make sure no one comes." Daniels clenched his jaw, trying to keep his composure. "Why is he after you? What did you do?" Tears streamed down her face. "I didn't mean to go into his house. I just wanted my bunny back." Daniel's heart sank. "The house we found you near, it's his?" She nodded, her sobs shaking her small frame. "I dropped my bunny in the yard. They told me not to go there, but I didn't listen." "Who told you?" Ramirez asked, glancing nervously out the window as the footsteps on the roof stopped. The cruiser was silent again, save for the sound of the girls crying. "The other kids," she said. "They said he doesn't like it when people come near his house. He takes them." Daniel's stomach churned. "Takes them where?" Her answer was a whisper, so soft it was almost swallowed by the night. "Where they can't come back." Before Daniels could ask more, the cruiser lurched violently to one side. The force threw Ramirez against the driver's side door, and Daniels had to tighten his grip on the girl to keep her from falling. The roar came again, louder and closer, and this time it was accompanied by a sound like nails scraping down the metal exterior of the car. Ramirez's voice was a mix of panic and anger. "We have to move. Sitting in here is just waiting to die." Daniels nodded, his mind racing. He knew Ramirez was right. The cruiser was no longer a safe haven, but leaving it meant exposing themselves to whatever was waiting outside. "We head for the woods," Daniels decided, his voice firm. "We'll lose them in the trees and call for help as soon as we're clear." Ramirez looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "The woods? You've seen what's out there. That's suicide." Daniels glanced at the girl, her tearful eyes locked on his. "She's our priority. We can't stay here." Another loud bang on the roof snapped their attention back. The metal caved in further, and this time, a deep, guttural growl came from directly above. It wasn't just a growl. It was a voice, low and menacing. "Come out," it rumbled. "You can't hide forever." Daniels made his decision. He flung open the back door and pulled the girl out with him. "Go. Now," he shouted to Ramirez. Ramirez hesitated for a split second before following, his weapon raised and ready. The three of them sprinted toward the woods, the girl's small cries drowned out by the pounding of their footsteps and the guttural roars behind them. The figures from the tree line began moving again, gliding toward them with terrifying speed. Daniels pushed himself harder, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He could hear the laughter now, high-pitched and cruel, echoing all around them. They reached the edge of the woods, the trees looming like dark sentinels. Daniels glanced back and saw the massive figure from the roof, now fully visible in the moonlight. It was tall, nearly twice the height of a man, with jagged, unnatural limbs and a face obscured by shadow. Its glowing eyes locked onto him, and it pointed one long, clawed finger in their direction. "You can run," it growled, its voice echoing through the night. "But you'll never escape." Daniels turned and plunged into the woods, Ramirez close behind. The The trees closed in around them, their branches clawing at their clothes as they ran. The laughter and growls faded slightly, but the sense of being hunted didn't. "Where are we going?" Ramirez panted, struggling to keep up. "Anywhere but here," Daniels replied, his breath ragged. He glanced down at the girl, her face pale and tear-streaked. "We're going to keep you safe. I promise." But even as he said the words, he wasn't sure if he believed them. The sound of heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush told him the hunt was far from over. And deep down, he knew the creature's words were true. They couldn't run forever. The forest was alive with an eerie energy. The crunch of leaves and snapping of twigs beneath their feet felt deafening against the heavy silence of the night. The further Daniels, Ramirez, and the girl ran, the darker the woods became, the moonlight struggling to pierce through the dense canopy. "Keep moving," Daniels urged, his grip tightening on the girl. He could hear the heavy footsteps behind them, unrelenting and deliberate, like the creature wasn't chasing them but herding them deeper into its territory. Ramirez was breathing heavily, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly. "Daniels, this isn't working. We're running blind out here." Daniels stopped for a brief moment, lowering the girl to the ground. He crouched down, holding her by the shoulders. "Sweetheart, I need you to tell us something. Is there anywhere safe? A place they can't follow?" The girl shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. "He owns this place," she whispered. "The forest, the house, everything. You can't hide from him." Daniels clenched his jaw. Her words only confirmed his worst fears. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't bound by the normal rules of their world. "Then we keep moving," Daniels said, determination masking his fear. He stood and gestured for Ramirez to lead the way. "We'll figure it out as we go." Ramirez hesitated, his flashlight sweeping over the trees. "This is insane. We don't even know where we're going. Would you rather go back to the cruiser?" Daniels snapped. "Because last I checked, that thing wasn't taking prisoners." Ramirez didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. He turned and began moving again, his steps quick and purposeful. Daniels followed, carrying the girl in his arms. Every now and then, he glanced over his shoulder, expecting to see glowing eyes or twisted shadows closing in. But the forest remained deceptively quiet, the only sounds coming from their own hurried footsteps and labored breathing. After what felt like hours, they stumbled into a small clearing. A fallen tree lay in the middle, its roots jutting out like skeletal hands. The clearing gave them a brief reprieve from the claustrophobic trees, but it also left them exposed. Ramirez slumped against the fallen tree, panting heavily. "We can't keep this up," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "We need a plan." Daniels set the girl down and leaned against the tree, his chest heaving. "You think I don't know that? I'm trying to figure this out as we go." The girl sat quietly on the ground, hugging her knees. Her stuffed rabbit dangled limply in one hand. For the first time, she looked less terrified and more resigned, as if she knew something they didn't. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Daniels asked gently, crouching down beside her. She hesitated before answering. "Lila." Daniels offered her a small smile. "Okay, Lila. My name's Daniels, and that's Ramirez. We're going to do everything we can to protect you, but we need your help. Can you tell us anything else about him? Anything at all?" Lila shook her head. "He doesn't like it when people talk about him. It makes him angry." Ramirez groaned, running a hand through his hair. "Great. Just great. So we're being hunted by some thing we can't even talk about." Daniels shot him a glare. "You're not helping." "I'm not trying to help," Ramirez snapped. "I'm trying to survive." Before Daniels could respond, a low, guttural growl echoed through the clearing. It was distant but unmistakable. Lila flinched, clutching her rabbit tighter. "They're close," she whispered. Daniels and Ramirez exchanged a glance, the unspoken tension between them forgotten. Ramirez grabbed his weapon and scanned the tree line, his flashlight sweeping over the dense underbrush. "We need to keep moving," Daniels said, his voice firm. "We can't stay here." But as they turned to leave the clearing, the shadows shifted. Figures began emerging from the trees, their glowing eyes cutting through the darkness. They moved slowly, deliberately, encircling the group. "We're surrounded," Ramirez muttered, raising his weapon. His hands trembled, the flashlight beam quivering. Daniels pulled Lila close, his mind racing. "Stay behind me," he told her. The figures stopped just at the edge of the clearing, their forms indistinct and flickering like shadows cast by an unseen flame. They didn't move closer, but their presence was suffocating. Then, a deep, bone-chilling voice spoke, reverberating through the air like thunder. "You should have stayed away." Daniel's blood ran cold. The voice wasn't coming from the figures. It was coming from the trees themselves. The massive figure from before stepped into the clearing, its twisted form towering over the others. Its eyes burned with a malevolent light, and its elongated limbs moved with an unnatural grace. "You cannot escape," it said, its voice low and menacing. "This place is mine." Ramirez fired a shot, the sound cracking through the night like lightning. The bullet struck the creature in the chest, but it didn't even flinch. Instead, it laughed, a deep, guttural sound that sent chills down their spines. "Foolish," it rumbled. "You think your weapons can harm me?" Daniels stepped in front of Lila, his weapon drawn. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice shaking but resolute. The creature tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing. "She broke the rules," it said, pointing a long, clawed finger at Lila. "And now she must pay." Daniels tightened his grip on his gun. "She's just a kid. Whatever this is, take it out on me. Leave her alone." The creature's laughter rumbled through the clearing, shaking the ground beneath their feet. "You are brave," it said, its voice dripping with mockery. "But bravery will not save you." As it spoke, the figures at the edge of the clearing began to close in, their movements slow and deliberate. The circle tightened, cutting off any chance of escape. Daniel's heart pounded as he looked at Ramirez, who stood frozen in place. "Ramirez, we're not going down without a fight," he said, his voice firm. Ramirez nodded, his jaw tightening. "Let's do this." The two officers stood back to back, their weapons raised, as the shadowy figures closed in. The creature watched from the center of the clearing, its glowing eyes gleaming with sadistic glee. And then, without warning, the shadows lunged. Daniels fired his weapon instinctively as the shadows lunged, the muzzle flashes briefly illuminating their twisted forms. Ramirez followed suit, his shots echoing through the clearing. The bullets seemed to pass through the figures without effect, as if they were shooting at smoke. The shadowy figures recoiled slightly with each shot, but regrouped almost instantly, pressing forward. "They're not stopping," Ramirez shouted, his voice tinged with panic. Daniels grabbed Lila and pulled her behind him. "Stay down, don't move," he ordered, his voice firm despite the chaos. The guttural laughter of the massive figure echoed through the clearing, drowning out the gunfire. "You cannot harm them," it rumbled, its voice thick with amusement. "They are mine, just as you will be." Daniel's mind raced. They were out of options. The shadowy figures were closing in, and the creature loomed in the center of the clearing like a predator toying with its prey. Ramirez emptied his clip, the sound of the last shot fading into the oppressive silence. "What now?" Ramirez yelled, his eyes darting around for an escape route. Daniels scanned the clearing, his breath coming in shallow gasps. There was nowhere to run. The figures had formed a tight circle, their glowing eyes unblinking as they advanced. Then, a faint voice cut through the tension. "Stop!" Daniels looked down at Lila, who was standing now, her small hands clenched into fists. Her voice trembled, but carried an unexpected strength. "Leave them alone," she cried. The creature turned its glowing eyes on her, tilting its head as if intrigued. "You dare to command me, child?" it growled, its tone both mocking and menacing. Lila stepped forward, her stuffed rabbit dangling from one hand. Daniels reached out to stop her, but she shook her head. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," she said, her voice growing steadier. "You can't scare me." The creature's laughter rumbled like distant thunder. "Oh, but I can do much more than scare you," it said, taking a step closer. The ground seemed to quake beneath its feet. Daniels grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "Lila, what are you doing?" he hissed. You can't reason with it. She looked up at him, her tear-streaked face filled with determination. I have to. It's the only way. Before Daniels could protest, Lila turned back to the creature. You said I broke your rules, she said. But I didn't mean to. I just wanted my bunny back. The creature regarded her for a moment, its glowing eyes narrowing. Intentions mean nothing, it rumbled. You trespassed where you did not belong. That alone demands punishment. Then punish me, she said, her voice steady. But let them go. Daniel's chest tightened. No, Lila. Quiet. The creature barked, its voice shaking the air. Daniels fell silent, his jaw clenching as he tightened his grip on his weapon. The creature leaned closer to Lila, its massive form casting a shadow that engulfed her entirely. You offer yourself in their place? It asked, its voice dripping with malice. Lila nodded, tears streaming down her face. Yes. The creature let out a deep, guttural laugh. How noble. How foolish. It raised one clawed hand, pointing toward Daniels and Ramirez. They will leave, but you will remain. That is my price. No. Daniels shouted, stepping in front of Lila. You can't have her. If you want someone, take me instead. The creature's laughter stopped abruptly. It stared at Daniels, its glowing eyes narrowing. You would trade your life for hers? It asked, its voice laced with disbelief. Yes, Daniels said firmly. She's just a kid. She doesn't deserve this. For a moment, the clearing fell silent, the air heavy with tension. The shadowy figures stopped their advance, their glowing eyes flicking between Daniels and the creature. Then, to everyone's shock, the creature straightened. Interesting, it said, its tone shifting. Such selflessness. It is rare. Daniels kept his weapon raised, his heart pounding. So, do we have a deal? The creature tilted its head, considering. Perhaps, it said slowly. But not tonight. Before anyone could react, the creature let out an ear-splitting roar. The shadowy figures dissolved into the darkness, their glowing eyes fading like dying embers. The creature itself began to dissipate, its massive form unraveling into tendrils of shadow that were carried away by the wind. Daniel stood frozen, his weapon still raised. What just happened? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ramirez lowered his gun, his hands trembling. Did it just leave? Lila dropped to her knees, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Her small frame shook with sobs, and Daniels quickly knelt beside her, wrapping her in his arms. It's okay, sweetheart, he whispered. It's gone. You're safe. But deep down, he wasn't so sure. The creature's parting words echoed in his mind. Not tonight. The group stumbled out of the forest an hour later, battered and exhausted. The air was still and quiet, as if the nightmare they'd endured had never happened. The cruiser was still where they'd left it, the roof dented and the doors scratched, but it was intact. Daniels helped Lila into the back seat, while Ramirez radioed for backup. For once, the signal went through. Unit 34 to dispatch, Ramirez said, his voice hoarse. We're clear, but we need immediate assistance. This is urgent. Daniels climbed into the driver's seat, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. He glanced at Lila in the rearview mirror. She was staring out the window, her expression distant. Lila, he said gently, is it really over? She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. They always come back. The cruiser rattled down the empty road, its damaged roof groaning with every bump. Daniels gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white against the dark leather. The forest loomed in the rearview mirror, its shadowy expanse fading into the distance. But the ominous weight of what had happened lingered like a storm cloud over their heads. Ramirez sat in the passenger seat, silent for once. His usual sarcasm was gone, replaced by a tense stillness as he stared out the window, his weapon resting in his lap. Neither of them spoke. The only sound was the low hum of the engine and Lila's quiet sniffles from the back seat. Daniels glanced at her through the mirror. Lila, he said softly, trying to break the silence. Do you have family? Someone we can take you to? She shook her head without looking up, her gaze fixed on the passing trees. Her stuffed rabbit dangled limply in her hand. No one's left, she whispered. Not anymore. The words hit Daniels harder than he expected. He exchanged a glance with Ramirez, who sighed and rubbed his temples. We'll take her to the station, Ramirez said, his voice low. Figure out what to do from there. Daniels nodded, but didn't reply. Something about leaving Lila at the station didn't sit right with him. She wasn't just another lost kid. They'd seen firsthand what she was dealing with, and it was far beyond anything the system was equipped to handle. They arrived at the station just as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. The building was a dull gray, its stark exterior a contrast to the fiery orange and pink hues streaking across the sky. Daniels pulled into the parking lot, the cruiser groaning to a stop. As they stepped out, Lila hesitated. She clutched her rabbit tightly, her eyes darting around as if expecting the shadows to reappear at any moment. Daniels knelt beside her, his voice calm and reassuring. You're safe here, Lila. Nothing can hurt you now. She looked at him, her small face filled with doubt. You don't know that. Daniels felt a pang in his chest. She was right. He couldn't promise her safety, not after what they'd seen. But he had to try. Come on, he said gently, holding out his hand. Let's get inside. Lila took his hand reluctantly, and they headed into the station. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their harsh glow a jarring contrast to the dim, natural light outside. The familiar hum of phones ringing and officers chatting should have been comforting, but it only amplified the sense of unease that clung to them. Captain Reeves, a grizzled man with a permanent scowl, approached as soon as they walked in. His sharp eyes flicked over Daniels, Ramirez, and Lila, lingering on the disheveled state of their uniforms. What happened out there? Reeves demanded, his voice gruff. You were off-grid for hours. Daniels exchanged a glance with Ramirez. We ran into trouble, he said cautiously. It's complicated. Reeves raised an eyebrow. Try me. Daniels hesitated, the memory of the creature's glowing eyes flashing through his mind. He knew how it would sound, like a fairy tale or the ramblings of a madman. But before he could answer, Lila spoke. They came after us, she said quietly, her voice steady despite her small frame. Because of me. Reeves frowned, his gaze shifting to her. And who's this? Daniels stepped in. This is Lila. We found her near that old house on Elm Street. Reeves' expression darkened. Elm Street? What were you doing there? It wasn't planned, Daniels said quickly. She was in the middle of the road. We stopped to help. Reeves crossed his arms, clearly unimpressed. And now you're telling me there's trouble? What kind of trouble, Daniels? Daniels hesitated again, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. We're dealing with something not human, he said finally. Reeves stared at him for a long moment before snorting. Not human? Are you serious? Do I look like I'm joking? Daniels shot back, his voice sharper than he intended. Before Reeves could respond, the lights flickered. The faint buzzing overhead grew louder, almost like static. The room fell silent as officers glanced around, their conversations trailing off. What the hell? Ramirez muttered. The lights flickered again, then went out completely, plunging the station into darkness. For a moment, everything was still. Then, faint whispers began to fill the air, low and indecipherable, like dozens of voices speaking all at once. Daniels instinctively moved closer to Lila, his hand on his holstered weapon. Stay close, he whispered. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The shadows in the room deepened, twisting and shifting unnaturally. Daniels, Ramirez said, his voice shaking. Tell me I'm not the only one hearing this. You're not, Daniels replied grimly. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the station, like a door slamming shut. The whispers stopped instantly, replaced by a suffocating silence. And then, in the darkness, a familiar voice rumbled. I told you, you cannot escape. The room erupted into chaos. Officers scrambled for their flashlights and weapons, their shouts overlapping as the shadows began to move. Shapes flickered in and out of sight, their glowing eyes piercing the darkness. Daniels pulled Lila close, shielding her with his body. Ramirez, we need to get her out of here, he shouted. Ramirez nodded, his flashlight trembling in his hand. Where do we go? We're trapped. The shadows closed in, their movements deliberate and predatory. The deep, guttural laughter of the creature echoed through the station, shaking the walls. Lila's voice broke through the noise. He won't stop, she said, her tone eerily calm. Not until he gets what he wants. Daniels crouched beside her, his heart racing. What does he want, Lila? Tell me. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. Me, she whispered. He wants me. The shadows surged forward, the creature's laughter growing louder. Daniels knew they were out of time. Then we fight, he said, his voice firm. We don't let him take you. But deep down, he feared it was a fight they couldn't win. The station was chaos. Officers barked orders, their flashlights darting wildly in the suffocating darkness. The shadows pressed closer, their glowing eyes reflecting in the beams of light. The guttural laughter of the creature echoed louder, shaking the walls and sending waves of dread through everyone inside. Daniels kept Lila close, her small frame trembling against him. Ramirez stood at his side, his weapon raised, his breathing uneven. Daniels, this isn't a fight we can win, Ramirez said, his voice cracking. We don't have a choice, Daniels shot back. We protect her, no matter what. From the far corner of the room, Captain Reeves shouted, What in God's name is going on here? Someone give me an explanation. Daniels turned to him, his jaw tight. You want an explanation? Look around. This thing isn't human, and it's not going to stop until it gets her. Reeves opened his mouth to argue, but before he could speak, the shadows surged forward. One officer screamed as a dark, claw-like appendage slashed through the air, sending his flashlight clattering to the floor. The beam spun wildly, illuminating the twisted shapes of the advancing figures. They're attacking, Ramirez yelled, firing into the darkness. His shots rang out, but as before, they seemed to have no effect. The shadows recoiled briefly but quickly regrouped, their movements fluid and unrelenting. Daniels scanned the room, his mind racing. They couldn't stay in the open. Ramirez, cover me, he shouted. Without waiting for a response, he grabbed Lila and darted toward a nearby hallway, her small cries muffled against his chest. Ramirez fired another volley of shots, his flashlight flickering as he backed toward the hallway. Reeves and a few other officers followed, their faces pale with fear. Fall back, Reeves barked, his usual commanding tone cracking under the weight of the situation. They retreated into the hallway, slamming the heavy door behind them. The muffled growls and whispers of the shadows echoed from the other side. Ramirez slid a filing cabinet in front of the door, his movements frantic. That's not going to hold them for long, he muttered. Daniels knelt beside Lila, brushing her hair out of her face. Are you okay? He asked gently. She nodded, though her wide, tear-filled eyes betrayed her fear. They're getting stronger, she whispered. What do you mean? Daniels asked, his voice low. She looked up at him, her voice trembling. Every time you fight them, it makes him stronger. He feeds on it. Daniels exchanged a grim look with Ramirez. So what are we supposed to do? Just let him take you? Lila shook her head, fresh tears streaming down her face. There's another way, she said hesitantly. But it's dangerous. What is it? Daniels pressed. She hesitated, clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly. The house, she said finally. We have to go back to the house. Ramirez stared at her like she'd lost her mind. The house? Are you kidding me? We barely made it out of there alive. It's the only way, Lila insisted. That's where he's strongest, but it's also where we can stop him. Daniels frowned, his mind racing. The idea of going back to that place filled him with dread, but Lila's words carried a strange conviction. How do we stop him? He asked. Lila hesitated again, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, weathered object. It was a locket, its silver surface tarnished and scratched. This, she said, holding it up. It belonged to him. Before he became what he is now, Daniels took the locket, his brow furrowing. What does it do? It can trap him, Lila said, but only if we use it in the house. That's where he's tied to. Reeves, who had been silent until now, shook his head. This is insane. You're talking about taking a child back to the place where all of this started. Daniels stood, his gaze steady. Do you have a better idea, Captain? Because sitting here isn't going to save us. Reeves looked away, his jaw tight. You're playing with fire, Daniels. We don't have a choice, Daniels replied. He turned to Ramirez. Are you with me? Ramirez hesitated, then sighed heavily. I've already come this far. Might as well see how it ends. Daniels nodded, then knelt beside Lila again. We're going to protect you, no matter what, he said. But you have to promise me something. If it gets too dangerous, you run. Don't look back. Lila's lip quivered, but she nodded. I promise. The sound of the shadows pounding against the door grew louder, the wood splintering under the force. They didn't have much time. Let's move, Daniel said, his voice firm. He lifted Lila into his arms and led the group down the hallway, Ramirez and Reeves close behind. The station parking lot was eerily quiet as they emerged into the dawnlight. The cruiser was still parked where they'd left it, its damaged roof and scratched exterior a stark reminder of what they were up against. Daniels helped Lila into the back seat, while Ramirez climbed into the passenger side. Reeves hesitated at the door, his expression torn. You're putting your lives on the line for this, he said. You better know what you're doing. Daniels met his gaze. I don't. But we don't have a choice. Reeves sighed and climbed into the back seat beside Lila. Daniels started the engine, the cruiser roaring to life. He glanced at Lila in the rearview mirror. Hold on tight, kid. We're going back. As they sped away from the station, the shadows began to gather again, their twisted forms flickering in the distance. The creature's guttural laughter echoed faintly behind them, a chilling reminder that their nightmare was far from over. And the house on Elm Street was waiting. The cruiser barreled down the desolate streets, the rising sun casting long, eerie shadows. Despite the light breaking over the horizon, the oppressive dread seemed to cling to them, growing heavier the closer they got to Elm Street. Daniels gripped the wheel, his knuckles white, his mind replaying everything Lila had said. The house held the key, but it was also the heart of the nightmare. In the back seat, Lila clutched her rabbit and the locket, her small hands trembling. Reeves sat beside her, his usual gruff demeanor replaced by quiet tension. This better not be a wild goose chase, he muttered. It's not, Lila said softly. It's the only way. Ramirez, in the passenger seat, glanced nervously out the window. Daniels, you sure about this? Feels like walking into a trap. Daniels nodded grimly. It's a trap, all right. But it's the only one we've got a chance of springing. We end this here. The street signs flashed by, the familiar, foreboding sight of Elm Street growing closer. As they turned onto the street, the air seemed to grow colder, and the usual sounds of the waking city, chirping birds, distant cars, faded into an unnatural silence. And there it was. The house loomed at the end of the street, its dark silhouette framed by the twisted branches of ancient trees. The broken windows seemed to stare at them like empty, soulless eyes. The overgrown yard was a mess of weeds and brambles, and the faint outline of the message smeared on the wall, "You're too late," was still visible, though it seemed to pulse with an unnatural glow. Daniel slowed the cruiser to a stop a few houses away. The engine hummed quietly, the only sound breaking the eerie stillness. "We goin' fast," he said, turning to the others. "Stick together and don't stop for anything. Ramirez, you're with me. Reeves, stay with Lila." Reeves frowned. "You expect me to just hang back while you—" "Yes," Daniels interrupted sharply. "Your job is to protect her. No matter what." Reeves glared at him but didn't argue further. Instead, he nodded reluctantly. "Fine. Let's get this over with." Daniels turned to Lila. "Are you ready?" She hesitated, her small hands tightening around the locket. "I don't think anyone's ever ready for this," she said quietly. Daniels gave her a reassuring nod. "We'll keep you safe. I promise." The group moved cautiously up the overgrown path to the house. The closer they got, the heavier the air seemed to grow, as if the house itself exuded a malevolent energy. Ramirez's flashlight beam danced over the cracked porch and the sagging front door, which now hung slightly ajar. "Great," Ramirez muttered. Looks like it's been waiting for us. Daniels ignored the comment and pushed the door open further, his weapon drawn. The interior was just as they remembered, dim, cold, and filled with the stench of decay. The furniture lay in ruins, and the message on the wall seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Lila clung to Reeves, her wide eyes scanning every shadow. "He's here," she whispered. "He knows we've come back." Daniels turned to her. "What do we do with the locket? Where does it go?" "The basement," she said, her voice trembling. "That's where he's strongest. That's where we can trap him." Ramirez groaned. "Of course it's the basement. Why wouldn't it be?" "Focus," Daniels snapped. "Let's move." They made their way through the house, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. Every creak of the floorboards beneath their feet felt deafening, and the air grew colder with every step. The shadows on the walls seemed to flicker unnaturally, as if they were alive. The basement door stood at the end of a narrow hallway, its dark wood scarred and splintered. Daniels reached for the handle, his breath fogging in the frigid air. He glanced back at the others. "Stay close." The door creaked open, revealing a set of steep, rickety stairs descending into darkness. A faint, guttural growl echoed from below, sending a chill down their spines. "Lovely," Ramirez muttered. "Let's walk right into the belly of the beast." Daniels shot him a warning look before starting down the stairs, his flashlight beam illuminating the damp, crumbling walls. The others followed, their footsteps echoing ominously. The basement was a cavernous space, far larger than it should have been. The walls seemed to stretch into darkness, and the air was thick with the stench of rot. In the center of the room stood a crude stone altar, its surface etched with strange, glowing symbols. The air around it pulsed with a sickly green light. Lila pointed to the altar. "That's where it has to go." Daniels approached cautiously, the locket in his hand. "What happens when we put it there?" "It will call him," Lila said. "But if we trap him inside before he fully manifests, he won't be able to hurt anyone again." "And if we fail?" Ramirez asked. Lila's eyes filled with tears. "Then he'll take all of us." Daniels exchanged a grim look with Ramirez. "No pressure," Ramirez muttered. As Daniels stepped closer to the altar, the growling grew louder, reverberating through the basement like thunder. The shadows on the walls began to twist and writhe, coalescing into the towering figure of the creature. "You dare return to my domain?" it growled, its glowing eyes narrowing. "You cannot defeat me." Daniels placed the locket on the altar, his hands steady despite the fear coursing through him. "We're about to find out." The room erupted into chaos. The creature lunged, its massive, clawed hands swiping at Daniels. Ramirez fired his weapon, the muzzle flashes briefly illuminating the creature's twisted form. Lila screamed, clutching Reeves as the shadows surged toward them. The locket began to glow, its light growing brighter and brighter as the symbols on the altar pulsed in response. The creature let out a deafening roar, its form flickering as if it were being pulled apart. Daniel shouted over the noise, "Lila, what now?" She pointed to the locket, her voice trembling. "You have to say his name. That's the only way to trap him." Daniel's mind raced. "What's his name?" Lila hesitated, her eyes wide with fear. I can't say it. It's too dangerous." The creature's laughter boomed through the basement. "Fools," it growled. "You cannot defeat what you do not understand." Daniels clenched his jaw. "Then tell me, Lila." "We don't have time." Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "It's—" The creature lunged again, cutting her off. The room erupted into chaos as Daniels raised his weapon, his voice echoing through the basement. "Ramirez, keep it back." "Lila, say the name." But her voice was drowned out by the roar of the creature, the air thick with tension as time ran out. The creature's guttural roar rattled the very walls of the basement, the sound so loud it felt as though it would tear the air apart. Daniels ducked as one of its massive claws swiped through the space where he'd just stood. Ramirez fired repeatedly, each shot illuminating the chaos for a fraction of a second, but the bullets passed through the creature like smoke. "Lila," Daniels yelled, his voice hoarse. "You have to say it now." The little girl was frozen, clutching Reeves tightly as her wide eyes locked on the creature. I can't, she stammered, shaking her head violently. If I say it wrong, he'll get stronger. Daniels gritted his teeth, his mind racing. He lunged toward the altar, grabbing the glowing locket and holding it high. Then tell me how to say it, he shouted. The creature turned its glowing eyes on him, its voice a menacing growl. You think that trinket can stop me? It began to move toward Daniels, its towering form blocking out the pulsing light of the altar. You will all be mine. Lila took a shaky breath, her voice trembling as she shouted, It's Saroth. Say it exactly like that, Sareth. Daniels didn't hesitate. He held the locket higher, his voice firm and unyielding. Saroth, I command you to be bound. The creature let out a deafening roar, its form flickering violently as if it were being torn apart. The shadows writhed and twisted around it, pulling it toward the altar. The glowing symbols on the stone began to pulse faster, their light growing blindingly bright. Keep going, Lila screamed. You have to say it again. Saroth, Daniels bellowed, his voice cutting through the chaos. Be bound. The creature's form began to collapse in on itself, its massive claws shrinking as the shadows pulled it closer to the altar. The room shook violently, debris falling from the ceiling as the air seemed to crackle with energy. Ramirez grabbed Daniels' arm. It's working. Keep it up. Daniels raised the locket one final time, his voice echoing with authority. Saroth, I command you to return to the void. Be trapped forever. The creature let out a final, blood-curdling roar as it was pulled into the locket. The glowing light from the altar surged, then exploded outward, sending a shockwave through the basement. Daniels was thrown backward, the locket flying from his hand and landing on the altar. The light faded as quickly as it had come, leaving the room eerily silent. Daniels groaned, pushing himself to his feet. His ears were ringing, and his body ached from the blast. He scanned the room, his heart racing. The altar was still intact, the locket sitting at its center, its glow dim but steady. Is everyone okay? Daniels called out, his voice hoarse. I'm fine, Ramirez replied, coughing as he dusted himself off. What the hell just happened? Reeves helped Lila to her feet, his expression a mix of shock and disbelief. Is it over? He asked, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. Daniels turned to Lila, who was staring at the locket with wide eyes. Did it work? He asked gently. She nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. He's gone, she whispered. We trapped him. Relief washed over Daniels, but it was short-lived. The basement walls creaked ominously, and a low rumble shook the floor beneath their feet. This place is falling apart, Ramirez shouted. We've got to get out of here. Daniels grabbed the locket from the altar, its surface warm to the touch. Come on, he said, ushering the group toward the stairs. They ran up the rickety steps, the sound of the collapsing basement growing louder behind them. The house groaned as if it were alive, its walls cracking and splintering. They burst through the front door just as the first floor caved in, a plume of dust and debris erupting behind them. The group stumbled into the yard, coughing and gasping for air. They turned to watch as the house crumbled inward, its twisted frame collapsing into a pile of rubble. The ground beneath it seemed to swallow it whole, leaving only a jagged, smoldering crater. For a long moment, no one spoke. The dawn light cast a soft glow over the street, a stark contrast to the destruction they had just escaped. It's done, Lila said quietly, her voice barely audible. He's gone. Daniels knelt beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. You were brave, Lila, braver than anyone I've ever met. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and sadness. But what if he comes back? She whispered. Daniels held up the locket, its glow now faint but steady. He won't, he said firmly. Not while we have this. Ramirez let out a shaky laugh, wiping sweat from his brow. Remind me never to take another call on Elm Street, he muttered. Reeves shook his head, still staring at the crater. I don't know what the hell we just dealt with, he said, but I'm glad it's over. Daniels stood, slipping the locket into his pocket. Let's get Lila somewhere safe, he said. She's been through enough. As they walked back to the cruiser, Lila glanced over her shoulder at the smoldering remains of the house. The shadows were gone, and the oppressive energy had lifted, but a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't finished. Are you sure he's really gone? She asked quietly. Daniels paused, looking back at the ruins. His jaw tightened. As long as we have this, he said, patting his pocket, he can't hurt anyone again. But deep down, a sliver of doubt lingered. The creature's voice echoed in his mind, its final words before being trapped in the locket. You may have won this time, but the shadows are endless. The drive back to the station was heavy with exhaustion. The rising sun bathed the quiet streets in a soft golden glow, a stark contrast to the terror that had gripped them only hours ago. Daniels kept one hand on the wheel and the other resting over his pocket, where the locket lay. Its faint warmth seemed to pulse against his palm, a constant reminder of what it contained. In the back seat, Lila sat silently, her eyes distant as she stared out the window. Reeves sat beside her, his usually sharp demeanor replaced by an uncharacteristic silence. Ramirez leaned back in the passenger seat, letting out a deep sigh. Tell me we're never going back to Elm Street, Ramirez said, breaking the quiet. His voice was tinged with a forced lightness, but the fear still lingered beneath it. We're not, Daniels replied firmly. Not ever. Back at the station, the atmosphere was tense. Word of the strange events had spread quickly, and the other officers eyed Daniels, Ramirez, and Reeves as they walked in with Lila. Daniels ignored the whispers and led the group to an empty room where Lila could rest. He crouched in front of her, his voice soft. You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you. Lila looked at him, her expression tired but resolute. You can't keep it forever, she said quietly, her gaze shifting to his pocket. It's dangerous. Daniels nodded slowly. I know. We'll find a way to keep it locked away, somewhere no one can ever reach it. Reeves, standing by the door, frowned. You really think the thing is gone? That it can't come back? Daniels hesitated, his mind flashing back to the creature's parting words. I think it's trapped, he said carefully. As long as the locket stays sealed, it can't hurt anyone. Reeves didn't look convinced, but he didn't press the issue. So what do we do with her? He asked, gesturing to Lila. She's staying with me, Daniels said without hesitation. Ramirez blinked. Wait, what? Daniels, are you sure about that? Daniels nodded. She's been through enough. She doesn't have anyone else, and until we figure out how to keep this thing locked away for good, I'm not letting her out of my sight. Lila's eyes widened slightly, and for the first time that day, she smiled, a small, tentative expression of gratitude. Thank you, she whispered. The next few days passed uneventfully, but the lingering tension never quite faded. Daniels kept the locket in a locked safe in his home, its presence a constant weight on his mind. Lila adjusted slowly to her new surroundings, her nightmares frequent but less intense as the days went on. One evening, as Daniels sat on the couch reading, Lila approached him hesitantly, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly in her arms. Can I ask you something? She said softly. Of course, Daniels replied, setting his book aside. Do you think it's really over? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniels considered her question carefully. I think we did everything we could, he said. And as long as we're careful, I believe we'll be okay. Lila nodded, but her expression remained uncertain. He said the shadows are endless, she murmured. What if that means there are others? Daniel's stomach tightened, but he forced himself to smile. If there are, then we'll deal with them when the time comes. Together. Lila smiled faintly, her eyes shining with a mix of hope and fear. Okay. Months later, Daniel stood in a secure facility far from the city, watching as the locket was sealed inside a reinforced vault. The room was lined with thick steel walls, monitored by cameras and alarms to ensure no one could access it. As the vault door closed with a resounding clang, Daniels felt a sense of relief. The locket was no longer his burden, but he knew its presence would haunt him for the rest of his life. Back at home, Lila was waiting for him, her smile brighter than he'd ever seen. You're back, she said, running to hug him. Daniels knelt to embrace her. "I'm back," he said. "And it's done." They stood there in the warmth of the evening light, a moment of peace finally settling over them. For the first time in months, Daniels allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could move forward. But as he looked out the window, a faint shadow flickered across the yard. So brief he almost didn't notice. His heart skipped a beat, but when he looked again, there was nothing there. He pushed the thought aside and turned back to Lila, who was smiling up at him with genuine trust in her eyes. They were safe now. At least, he hoped they were.